The year is 1843. High in the mountains of northern Mesopotamia, where stone monasteries cling to cliffsides like prayers carved into rock, something ancient stirs in the valleys. The monasteries of Hakkari in the Assyrian highlands have stood for centuries, silent witnesses to empires that rose and crumbled like dust. Behind their walls live women who have surrendered everything to faith. Christian nuns, keepers of sacred texts, guardians of ancient liturgies sung in Aramaic, the language of Christ himself. They believe their devotion will protect them. They are wrong, because descending upon their world is not an army driven by conquest or territorial ambition. What comes is something far more primal, a force that understands instinctively what modern warfare would later codify into doctrine, that the complete destruction of an enemy requires more than killing their soldiers. It requires the annihilation of their spirit, the corruption of their sacred, transformation of their holiest symbols into monuments of despair. The Kurdish tribes under Ibrahim Pasha and Bedir Khan Beg are coming, and what they will do to these nuns will become a weapon more devastating than any siege engine ever built. This is not a story about military strategy written in war colleges. This is a story about psychological warfare in its most visceral, most unforgivable form. A story about how human beings weaponize the sacred itself, how they transform religious devotion into a trap, how they engineer suffering so profound that survival becomes its own form of damnation. The mountains are about to learn a terrible truth. Sometimes death is mercy, and mercy is the first thing to die. To understand what happened, you must first understand what a nun represented in 1840s Mesopotamia. In the Assyrian Christian communities scattered across the Ottoman Empire's most remote regions, nuns were not simply religious figures. They were living symbols of communal purity, embodiments of collective honor, guardians of spiritual continuity. Their virginity was not personal, it belonged to the entire community. Their prayers sustained not just their own souls, but the spiritual protection of villages, families, bloodlines. This was the ancient Christian East, where religion and identity were inseparable, where community survival depended on maintaining sacred boundaries, where the violation of those boundaries meant something far worse than physical destruction. And the attackers understood this perfectly. Ibrahim Pasha and Bedir Khan Beg were not mindless killers. They were sophisticated actors in a complex regional power struggle. Kurdish tribal leaders navigating the treacherous politics of a fragmenting Ottoman Empire. They understood honor systems, shame cultures, the symbolic architecture of the societies they sought to subjugate. They knew that killing Assyrian Christian men would create martyrs. Burning churches would create rallying points. But targeting the nuns, corrupting the uncorruptible, defiling the sacred feminine, transforming symbols of purity into living monuments of violation that would break something fundamental, that would create a psychological wound that would never heal. This was cognitive warfare before the term existed. The deliberate engineering of trauma to destroy a population's will to exist as a distinct community. The human mind contains certain sacred spaces, zones of absolute protection. And when those zones are invaded, when the mind's most fundamental categories, sacred, profane, pure, corrupted, protected, violated, collapse into each other, something in consciousness itself fractures. The attackers were about to engineer precisely that collapse. If this kind of deep historical analysis interests you, the psychology behind empires, the dark strategies that shape civilizations, this channel explores these shadows every week. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. We're just getting started with this story, and what happens next is worse than you can imagine. Summer 1843. The Kurdish irregular forces move through the mountain passes with the confidence of men who know the terrain, who know their prey, who know that no Ottoman garrison will arrive in time. Perhaps no garrison will arrive at all. The empire is weak here, crumbling. The Sultan's authority extends only as far as his soldiers can march, and these mountains belong to whoever can hold them. The monasteries and convents are isolated by design, positioned for spiritual contemplation, not military defense. Stone walls built to keep worldly distractions out, not armies. The nuns inside have spent years, sometimes decades, in prayer. Their bodies are softened by fasting, their hands calloused only from the beads of prayer ropes, their eyes trained to see divine light in illuminated manuscripts, not danger approaching from the valleys. They receive warnings. Refugees from lower villages bring stories, tallies of destruction, of men killed, of families scattered, of churches burned. The nuns pray harder. They believe their devotion will shield them, that God will turn away the sword raised against his faithful servants. They are about to learn what their attackers have always known, that faith makes you vulnerable, that devotion creates predictability, that holiness itself becomes a weapon in the hands of those willing to corrupt it. The Kurdish forces reach the first convent on a morning thick with heat, but the nuns are at prayer. Their voices rise in ancient Syriac hymns, the same hymns their predecessors sang when these mountains were Christian kingdoms, when Assyrian churches dotted every valley, when their civilization was the intellectual heart of the Christian East. The doors splinter, the hymns stop, and what begins next is not battle. It is the systematic implementation of psychological annihilation. What the Kurdish forces do is neither random nor chaotic. It is methodical, ritualized, designed to maximize psychological impact. They do not simply kill the nuns, they separate young from old, beautiful from plain. They create hierarchies of violation, forcing the nuns to watch as their sisters are chosen, one by one, for fates they can only imagine in their worst nightmares. The waiting itself becomes torture, the anticipation, the knowledge that your turn is coming. This is the psychology of the lineup, the selection. It appears in every genocide, every mass atrocity, because it works, because it breaks the mind before the body is ever touched. The attackers understand shame culture instinctively. They know that for these women, physical violation is not just physical, it is spiritual annihilation. It is the destruction of identity itself. They know that in this culture, in this time, a violated woman becomes an unperson, neither living nor dead, expelled from the sacred community she has devoted her life to serving. They also know that some nuns will be taken as captives, distributed among the fighters as spoils, forced into households as servants, concubines, living trophies. But what makes this worse, infinitely worse, is that some will be released, sent back to their communities as walk-in proof of what happened, as living messages. This is the cruelest calculation. The survivors will carry the message more effectively than any dead body. Their presence will contaminate the sacred spaces they once sanctified. They will become living proof that God did not protect his faithful. That prayer failed. That devotion was meaningless against force. The psychological impact radiates outward like shockwaves from an explosion. Other Christian communities hear what happened. They understand the message. Your God will not save you. Your sacred boundaries mean nothing. Your holiest members are not protected. Submission is your only option. This is how psychological warfare breaks populations without needing to destroy everyone. You create an example, so horrifying that it colonizes the minds of everyone who hears about it. But there is another layer, another dimension of psychological engineering that reveals the sophistication of this terror. Some nuns are not killed, not kept as slaves. They are offered a choice: convert to Islam and live. Marry one of your captors and be integrated into his household. Renounce Christ and embrace Muhammad. Abandon your vows and your community and survive. Or refuse and face consequences too terrible to speak aloud. This is the ultimate psychological trap. If they refuse and are killed, they die as martyrs, which gives their death meaning, purpose, dignity. But if they convert, they survive as living betrayals, as proof that their faith was not strong enough, that when tested they broke. Some choose conversion. Of course they do. The human survival instinct is overwhelming, and in that moment, knife at throat, violence already witnessed, exhausted and traumatized and terrified, making that choice seems like the only way to stop the immediate horror. But that choice becomes a prison, because now they must live with it. In communities where conversion from Christianity to Islam is seen as apostasy, as fundamental betrayal, as spiritual death worse than physical death, women who convert are sometimes rejected by their own families, expelled from their communities, cut off from every social bond that gave their life meaning. The attackers understand this perfectly. They create a scenario with no good options. Resist and die in agony. Submit and lose your identity. Convert and live as a ghost, belonging to neither world, rejected by your people, never fully accepted by your captors. This is psychological warfare at its most refined. It is not about killing the body. It is about destroying the self, about creating conditions where every choice leads to annihilation. And for the nuns who are forced into households, married to their captors, the psychological torture continues indefinitely. They must bear the children of men who destroyed their communities, They must perform wifely duties to men whose hands are stained with the blood of their sisters. They must live every day in cognitive dissonance so severe it approaches madness, maintaining sanity while inhabiting fundamentally incompatible with their sense of self. Some break completely, retreating into catatonia. Others become hollow, going through motions with dead eyes. A few, very few, find ways to survive with some fragment of themselves intact, but all of them carry the wound forever. For those nuns who somehow survive and return to Christian communities, a different nightmare waits. They are no longer pure, no longer sacred, no longer symbolic guardians of communal honor. They're contaminated, polluted, living evidence of shame. In shame on our cultures, the victim of sexual violence carries the stain, not the perpetrator. This seems incomprehensible to modern Western sensibilities, but it is the dominant framework across much of traditional human society. Honor is located in women's bodies. A woman's violation diminishes not just her, but her entire family, her lineage, her community. So the survivors come home to find there is no home. Families turn them away. Other nuns refuse to speak to them. Children are taught not to look at them. They become non-persons, ghosts walking through villages where they once held positions of spiritual authority. Some monasteries refuse to take them back, even if the women maintained their faith, even if they resisted conversion, even if they did nothing wrong. The fact of violation itself is disqualifying. They can no longer represent purity. They can no longer be living prayers. The sacred function they served no longer exists for them. This is social death. It is a recognized phenomenon in trauma studies. When someone survives an atrocity but finds themselves expelled from the social fabric that gave their life meaning, they enter a liminal state, alive but not living, present but not belonging. Many survivors don't survive this second destruction. Suicide rates are high, not because of the initial trauma, but because of the aftermath. Because they discover that survival itself is a form of damnation. This is what the attackers counted on. This is why sexual violence against nuns was not incidental to the terror campaign. The point was never simple destruction. The point was to create a wound in the social fabric that would never heal, to transform survival into suffering, to make death seem like the better option. For decades after the massacres of 1843, official records remained sparse. The Ottoman Empire does not investigate. Kurdish tribal leaders face no consequences. The European powers express mild concern, but take no action. And the survivors? They carry their testimony in silence, because who can they tell? Who will believe them? Who wants to hear stories that indict the social structures everyone depends on for order? Stories that reveal how easily sacred protections collapse, how fragile civilization actually is. Missionaries who visit the region years later report encountering women who will not speak, who flinch at sudden movements, who stare at nothing with eyes that have seen something they can never unsee. The missionaries write carefully worded reports about distressing incidents and regrettable violence. They use euphemism because the truth is too dark for Victorian sensibilities, but the local communities know. Every Assyrian Christian in those mountains knows what happened and what it means. They know that the mountains are not safe, that devotion does not protect, that their daughters are vulnerable, that their sacred traditions can be weaponized against them. This knowledge changes a community's psychology permanently. It creates hypervigilance, suspicion, a constant sense of threat. Families begin restricting women's movements more severely. Monasteries are abandoned or heavily fortified. The spiritual landscape itself contracts, becoming defensive, paranoid, traumatized. This is the long-term payoff of psychological warfare. The trauma perpetuates itself. It colonizes the next generation. Children grow up in communities saturated with fear they don't fully understand but absorb anyway. They inherit anxieties, restrictions, unspoken rules designed to prevent a repeat of horrors they only know through silence and absence. The attackers are long dead, but their weapon continues to operate. The wound continues to bleed. To understand this as warfare, not mere atrocity, requires examining the strategic logic. Throughout history, rape and warfare has been dismissed as a side effect, collateral damage, the unfortunate behavior of undisciplined soldiers. But increasingly, historians and conflict analysts recognize that sexual violence in conflict is often strategic, calculated, deliberately deployed to achieve specific political and psychological objectives. In the case of the Assyrian Christians, the targeting of nuns served multiple strategic purposes. First, demoralization. It demonstrated that the Christian population could not protect its most sacred members, that their God was either unwilling or unable to intervene. That resistance was futile. Second, social fragmentation. By creating survivors who could not be reintegrated, it fractured community cohesion. It turned families against each other. It made trust impossible. Third, territorial control. Traumatized populations are easier to control. They're less likely to resist, more willing to accept subordinate status if it means avoiding a repeat of horror. Fourth, identity destruction. By forcing conversions and mixing bloodlines, it attacked the very foundations of Assyrian Christian identity. Future generations would carry the genetic and cultural traces of conquest, making cultural continuity more difficult to maintain. Fifth, message amplification. The horror of what happened spread far beyond those mountains. Other Christian communities throughout the region received the message clearly: submit or face the same fate. This is why the violence against nuns was worse than death. Death ends. Death can be mourned, ritualized, integrated into communal memory as sacrifice or martyrdom. But this violence created a wound that could not heal. It poisoned the present and contaminated the future. It turned survival itself into an ongoing punishment. The events of 1843 are a single episode in a much longer history of violence against Assyrian Christians, but they illuminate something essential about psychological warfare. Its effects compound over time. The trauma of 1843 was still fresh when new waves of violence struck in 1895, and again in 1915, during the Assyrian Genocide that unfolded alongside the Armenian Genocide. Each new atrocity reactivated the wounds of previous ones. Each new generation inherited not just the memory but the embodied trauma, hypervigilance, the mistrust, the sense of existential vulnerability. Neuroscience now confirms what survivors always knew. Severe trauma changes brain structure. It alters how memories are stored, how threats are perceived, how the self is constructed. And when that trauma is communal, when everyone in a community shares the same wounds, it becomes woven into the culture itself. This is intergenerational trauma. It is documented in Holocaust survivors and their descendants, in Native American communities, in any population that has faced systematic attempts at annihilation. The trauma becomes cellular, epigenetic, structural. The Assyrian Christian diaspora today numbers in the millions, scattered across every continent. Many have never been to those mountains, but they carry the weight of what happened there. It shapes their identity, their caution, their sense of safety and in those mountains themselves, monasteries that were once centers of Christian learning now stand empty, ruins. The Christian population that was once a majority is now a tiny, dwindling minority. The culture that produced some of Christianity's greatest scholars and mystics survives primarily in exile. This is the long-term victory of psychological warfare. It doesn't just kill people, it kills futures. It makes certain ways of being in the world impossible. It forecloses possibilities. In war colleges and military academies, strategists study psychological operations. They analyze propaganda, deception, information warfare. They learn to quantify morale as a tactical factor. They discuss winning hearts and minds as if these are territories to be captured. But what happened in those mountains in 1843 reveals something these sanitized discussions often miss. Psychological warfare at its most effective is not about changing minds. It is about breaking them. It is about creating trauma so profound that it becomes self-perpetuating. The Kurdish forces who attacked those monasteries used no sophisticated technology. They wrote no psychological operations manual. They simply understood instinctively what every perpetrator of atrocity understands, that certain forms of violence create wounds that never close. They understood that you can kill a person and end their suffering, but if you violate them in specific ways, if you attack not just their body, but their identity, their sacred self-concept, they're placed in the social order. If you do it publicly, ritually, with witnesses, you create suffering that transcends the individual, suffering that spreads, suffering that reproduces itself in the minds of everyone who hears about it. This is why what happened to those nuns was worse than death, because it was designed to be. Because the cruelty was not incidental, it was the point. Because the goal was never simple destruction. It was the creation of permanent psychological devastation. And the weapon is still working. Over 180 years later, the wound is still bleeding. Before we close this, I want to thank those of you who've made it this far. This isn't easy content, but if you believe this kind of historical truth matters, if you think understanding the psychology of power and violence is essential, then subscribe and share this video. The algorithm doesn't favor dark history, you do. Your engagement keeps this channel alive. You now carry this knowledge. The question is, what will you do with it? Some will turn away. The horror is too much. The darkness too deep. It is easier to pretend these things belong safely in the past, that such systematic cruelty could never happen again, that we have evolved beyond such barbarism. But we have not. The same psychological mechanisms that made this atrocity possible exist in every human society. The same capacity for dehumanization, the same weaponization of shame and honor, the same strategic logic that recognizes psychological destruction is more effective than physical destruction. It is happening right now in conflicts around the world. Sexual violence is being deployed as a weapon of war in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Myanmar, in Sudan, in Syria. Women are being targeted not incidentally but strategically. Their violation is calculated to destroy communities, fragment societies, make resistance impossible. The details change. The technology evolves. But the underlying psychology remains constant. Attack the sacred, and you attack everything. This documentary exists because some truths are too important to let die in silence. Because the survivors deserve to be witnessed. Because the next time someone dismisses atrocities as ancient history or tribal violence, or unfortunate but inevitable, you will know better. You will know that what happened in those mountains was not mindless savagery. It was psychological warfare in its purest form. A weapon so effective that its effects continue to resonate across centuries. And you will know that the greatest victory we can achieve, the only victory that matters, is refusing to allow such darkness to operate in silence and shadow. Witness is resistance. Memory is defiance. And the refusal to look away is the first step toward ensuring it never happens again. The nuns are gone, but their suffering demands to be remembered, not for the sake of perpetuating trauma, but for the sake of honoring what was lost, for the sake of understanding what humans are capable of, for the sake of building a world where such weapons can never be deployed again. That world does not exist yet, but it could, if we learn the lessons written in blood and tears in those ancient mountains. If we refuse to forget. This script is based on the documented massacres of Assyrian Christians in the 1840s, particularly the campaigns led by Kurdish tribal leaders under Ottoman authority. While specific details about attacks on nuns are drawn from survivor testimonies and missionary reports from the period, the psychological analysis represents a modern understanding of conflict trauma and strategic sexual violence. The events described are part of the broader context of Ottoman-era religious violence that culminated in the Assyrian Genocide of 1914 to 1918, recognized by multiple nations and historians as systematic ethnic and religious cleansing.